if you don't have the horse relaxed and doing everything right, they're not going to breed, they're not going to use themselves properly, and usually they won't finish the race as strongly as they're capable of doing.
Hi everyone, Karen here. Welcome back to another episode of Changing Rein. This week's guest is Fran Berry. Fran was a top Irish jockey who switched careers to become an analyst with Racing TV. As someone outside racing, I really enjoyed chatting to Fran and learning more about the sport. He has lots to say about the relationship between riders and trainers, riders and owners, and of course, riders and horses. I think you'll particularly enjoy where he speaks about the cues that riders use during races. It's a situation most of us will never be in, but it's absolutely fascinating nonetheless. Now, before we begin, I feel it's important to remember that Mita and I are horse welfare advocates. She is an equine vet and I am an equine welfare scientist. In our big Changing Rein tent, everyone is welcome and our guests come from all over, and we do that intentionally. That means sometimes our guests share ideas that really align with our own, and sometimes they don't, and that's okay. In this podcast, Fran generously shares how he sees things, and we loved talking to him. I imagine those who feel equestrian sport and racing are on the right track will find themselves agreeing with many of his ideas. And for those listeners who feel equestrian sport and racing have a long way to go to improve horse welfare, it's likely you will disagree with some of his views. Whether you agree or disagree, we love that you care enough to have an opinion. Our goal is to promote conversations that lead to positive change for horses and people in the horse industry. So, for today's episode, here's our Changing Rein challenge to you. We want you to ask yourself, why do I agree or disagree with these ideas? And we want you to keep asking yourself why, so you really get to the heart of what you believe. Because so often we don't spend any time considering these things and our responses are very automatic. And it's when we are aware of our fundamental beliefs and begin to question them that we can start to learn about ourselves and why we see the world the way we do, because we don't all see it the same. Here's an example of what can happen when enough people ask themselves why and find they don't like the answers they're getting. While growing up, my mum would talk about how when she got married, she was forced to quit her job in the public service. Married women weren't allowed to work in the public service in Australia back then. Why? Because the accepted view was that women were inferior to men, and once married, they shouldn't be allowed to take men's jobs, and their rightful place was in the home, bearing and caring for children. Now, in the beginning, feminists who believed that women were the equal of men and who took to the streets advocating for equal opportunity were considered fanatics. These days, young people will find this story hard to believe, so changed are our views about the roles of men and women. So you can see how over time our views and beliefs change, and sometimes those people we call fanatics and extremists perhaps aren't that crazy. They can just see things that we haven't noticed yet. So, without further ado, we hope you'll take up the Changing Rein challenge and we hope you enjoy today's episode. Let's go listen to Fran.
Today we're absolutely delighted to welcome Fran Berry, who was one of Ireland's leading jockeys after a successful career that spanned 23 years, in which he rode nearly 1,300 winners. In the tradition of a lot of our Changing Rein guests, he did a career pivot and he's now a highly regarded analyst with Racing TV. Fran, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Meet Karen. Thank you very much for having me. It's really good, and looking forward to seeing how your show goes over the coming months. But
Oh, thanks so much for joining us, Fran. And 1,300 winners, that's incredible in anyone's language. I'm just wondering, can you tell us what's your most memorable ride and why is it your most memorable ride?
do you know? Look, I had a lot of good days. Obviously, with Ryle Ascot, I was lucky enough to ride 4 winners there at the meeting. It's an international occasion, but I think smaller days mattered more, if that makes sense. You know, the big days were fantastic, and to get them wins meant a lot. But on certain days at smaller provincial tracks, if you like, in Ireland, to get a win for a small stable often meant a lot. And you know, when trainers have 5, 6, 8, 10 horses and you get a horse to win a couple of handicaps or something, I think without naming specific horses, I used to get more enjoyment from riding winners for people that small handicap or that small maiden win mattered, and it was maybe the difference in them having a good year and a bad year. You know, that horse, if it won, they got another horse in the back of it, or they got to sell it on, and that kept the ship afloat. So, you know, I think the appreciation that you got from connections on a smaller day was often overlooked, and I think you know, that was definitely the most satisfaction I got from winning. Winning obviously on good days for bigger stables, fantastic, but I think when people are, you know, this is a do or die kind of thing, if you like, when you go to a race, they've one horse to win with for the month and you get the job done or you make a difference. I think that was definitely the most pleasing.
As I said earlier, Fran, you've pivoted a few times. I mean, you started out over jumps, I think, didn't you? And then moved to the flat, then you moved to England, and then, of course, the latest pivot from jockey to racing analyst. What stands out for you about those pivots? Or, you know, were they things you had planned, or were they force of circumstances? So, you know, how did it all unfold?
Yeah, I'm not sure I ever planned anything, Rita, really. It was just kind of the way things panned out as the career went on. And back when I started riding, I was probably the tallest young rider starting off. You could get a licence when you're 15. I was in school doing my junior cert, and Dad rounded up a couple of horses through his friends when he was training for me basically to ride and get a bit of experience. So I had 6 or 7 rides. I went to Navan on a bank holiday Monday, May bank holiday, and Loch Mogue, which my mum had leased off a good friend of ours, Tom McParland. Julie won a 23 runner handicap. I can remember everything about that day. It was fantastic, and we played a replay over the winter on Racing TV. It was quite emotional looking back, and now at this stage back in 1996. But you know, when I started, weight was always going to be an issue for me, so it was assumed, given that my dad was a jump jockey all of his career in the main, that I would transition to the jumps, and I took out a jumps license, mainly possibly through weight, but more so I just wanted to ride. So again, a couple of horses rounded up by my dad for me to get experience on, and that took off. It really went well. I ended up on a couple of good horses and went to Aintree, the Grand National meeting, and ironically enough, that win over jumps got me going on the flats. Most people assumed I would have stayed over jumps or completely went to the jumps, but my weight had actually settled down. So I got up one morning in April and I just said, the flat is going too well and the risk of getting injured over jumps, I got to stop riding over jumps. And I never really went back after that.
Mita tells me you spent a few winters in Japan. Is that unusual for an Irish jockey? And were there things that you noticed were different between how horses are trained and managed in Japan compared to Ireland?
I needed to keep riding to do something to keep my weight off, so I needed to keep going. So any opportunity came to go abroad, I went abroad. I ended up in Macau for a couple of winters, and then on to Singapore, and they were a great experience. I got offered a contract to ride in Japan, a life-changing, career-changing opportunity to go to Japan. I had no expectations when I went there, didn't have a clue what was happening. My first interpreter wasn't from a racing background, so I was literally going out with 7 or 8 rides on my first weekend. I just about knew the distance because it was in metres, but I didn't know if I was on a favourite or 100 to 1 chance, anything. So it was really shooting in the dark. But by some miracle, everything went very well in my first I went initially for a month and ended up staying for almost 3 months. I just kept extending the time out.
I'm just wondering, I suppose one of the focuses of this podcast, we're looking at the sustainability of horse sport, and of course from a welfare lens, a welfare perspective. I'm just wondering, can you say in general sense what struck you? Do they have a view on equine welfare in Japan, or how is it seen by the Japanese racing fans?
Yeah, it's very important, and one thing about Japanese racing that's very noticeable is the longevity of the Japanese breed. They don't start racing them as 2-year-olds too early. They generally start from midsummer onwards, and their 2-year-old races are often run at 1,400 metres, a mile, even a mile, up to 2,000 metres, a mile and a quarter. They're a bigger type of unit, and they're all from European or American pedigrees that they've bought up over the years. And I think that longevity is true, giving the horse time to develop and not pressing them too hard too soon. It's not about speed over there. It's all about middle distance racing to a point. And if they end up being good sprinters, there is a program for them to drop back as they get older. But as regards welfare, their veterinary checks are very, very stringent. And if there's any issue with a horse, they'll be given a lot of time off. And if they run below par or are beating a certain distance, they have to be fully checked out. And they're very, very meticulous in what to do. Like anything in Japan, it's all I wouldn't say overanalyzed, but heavily analysed, and it's all, everything's taken into account. But the Japanese racing public really take horses into their heart, even at a lower level. So there is an onus on the JRA and the professionals to make sure the horse are going to race in tip-top condition. And if they don't run to their expected level, there is questions asked, whether it's from a welfare, veterinary point of view or a performance issue.
And in your latest pivot to analysis, you mentioned tactics. I think one of your real strengths is your tactical analysis, both before races and after races. But I was wondering, I suppose you get fan mail, and I'm just wondering, maybe you get some abuse. I don't know, but I suppose I'm just wondering whether any of that fan mail mentions welfare or welfare issues, or what sort of things do people bring up. Now, maybe that doesn't happen, but I'm just curious to know what happens this side of the world for someone like you who's in the public eye.
Yeah, it's a difference. It's very much a case of different cultures. Obviously, I lived in the UK for 3 years, and Racing TV is a UK broadcaster with the Irish rights as well. And if a horse in Ireland gets a bad fall over jumps, and if the greens are needed, if you like, for veterinary treatment, and you're waiting the outcome of that, and you're praying that everything will be okay at the horse, I more than likely will have a lot of tweets of English-based viewers, not Irish viewers. It's an interesting dynamic. I always found it a different culture, and that is very much quite noticeable. That if you go off air, say the last race, there is an instant you would have 3 or 4 tweets from English-based viewers, not Irish-based viewers. And also, when I was injured 1 or 2 times in hospital a lot of injuries over my career, but if I went to hospital in Ireland, the doctor and nurses would probably know racing, or to some extent, racing is very much more in the public eye, or more in the public conscience, I suppose, in Ireland to a point nowadays. And they would talk to you. They might know about racing, you being a jockey, but they'd never ask you about the horse. There wouldn't be any to ask question about the horse. But when I was in my final fall in Wolverhampton, I was in the hospital for 6 days, and everybody asked about the horse. It was just a different mindset, and it's not just horses with Ireland and England. That's all I can compare. Dogs are welcome in pubs in England. They're more culturally acceptable as an everyday accompanying to people where they go, whereas in Ireland it's not that level of dogs are outside the door to some extent. So maybe it's just different cultures, but definitely as regards getting people about welfare, it's more from the UK than it would be from Ireland.
Yeah, that's very interesting. This podcast we hope will have an international reach. We certainly have international guests, and that's one of the things we're interested in exploring.
Yeah, it's a cultural thing, and I think that's changing with Ireland as it becomes more urban, perhaps maybe as well. The country element is going out, and people are probably coming around to that way of thinking, and we're recording on the eve of what may be an uncomfortable documentary to be played out on Irish TV in prime time. So what comes out of that, we don't know, but you'd hope that anything that does pop up that we can take from it and make sure it doesn't happen again and learn from it going forward.
Yeah. One of the things that Mita and I are quite interested, and we've had a chat to quite a few of our guests about this topic, which is about the gear that horses wear, not only in racing but in other sports as well. And, there's different bits and nosebands and things like that. So I'm just curious, what role does the jockey play in terms of what gear is used on the racehorse?
Very much depends on the relationship that you have with the trainer of the horse. If you're dealing with a stable and you're in there riding track work maybe 2 or 3 days a week, generally over time I was able to build up a rapport with the trainers that if I said that a horse was pulling too much, that he might need, rather than a normal snaffle bit, he might need a more severe bit and a chiffney bit, which will allow you to control the horse more, or without having to fight with him too much. The trainer would put that on a morning bit of work, and if it works, they leave it on for the race. And there would be different elements to that too. If it wasn't a chiffney, maybe they're very sensitive mouth, rather than having a steel bit in their mouth, they might have a rubber type bit or rubber cover bit in their mouth. So it's degrees of what works with the individual horse, and that was one of the most enjoyable things that I got when I was working with certain stables, that your feedback and the rapport you had with the trainer, you could try and get the best result for your horse and owner by trying something or experimenting with something, but you're using your experience that you've built up from the time you're a kid, really, from riding ponies to on to riding racehorse, to see this bit will suit that horse. It won't always work, but generally with trial and error you'll get there, or it might work first time, but it can make a huge difference to the performance of a horse, because if you don't have the horse relaxed and doing everything right, they're not going to breed, they're not going to use themselves properly, and usually they won't finish the race as strongly as they're capable of doing.
Yeah, so a couple of the pieces of equipment that get brought up regularly in terms of concerns about welfare are things like, well, obviously the whip's a big one, and things like tongue ties. So I'm just curious, you've clearly got so much experience riding horses. What are your thoughts about these sorts of pieces of equipment? And if the future of racing depends on it, do you think you can ride races without these sorts of pieces of equipment?
Yeah, as regards to whip, it's a very, very difficult one to answer when you're dealing with a worldwide sport and the different cultures involved. I'll use Hong Kong as an example, where there's no whip rules at all. You're dealing with a strong punting community there. The Chinese community like to see a lot of vigour in the way the horse are ridden, and an appearance of use of the whip, particularly in the last couple of furlongs of a race, to ensure to their eye at least that the horse is doing its best, and the rider's asking for 100% effort. And then you have Japan, which has gradually brought in some whip rules, and then obviously down in Australia for you, Karen, where they have brought in restrictions until the final 100 metres of a race, when you see the red poles. In Europe, we rode back on our whip use. France is 4 strikes, I think it is now. The UK, 7 at the last count, and Ireland has recently brought in stricter whip rules. I do think when you look back on things now, when you're allowed to use the whip or 9, 10, 11 times in a race, when you look at it now, it didn't really stack up. I do think we're nearly getting to happy medium now, and I wouldn't like to see things, from my point of view, roll back any further. But that's me as a horseman saying that I like that. I think the use of the whip is important for correction and encouragement, and the current whips don't do any harm to a horse, in my opinion at least. But you're dealing with a different element of society now that maybe don't find the whip use appealing. But the one thing that I am worried about, if we roll back to 0 strikes to whip, but I've ridden in Sweden where you can use the whip a couple of times. Now they're back to not using it at all, so they're gone 0 whip use effectively. You can carry the whip. From what I know is that when you get to the whip and that goes, where does it stop? With racing, with animals, that's it. What's the next step? Is it jump racing next after the whip? Is it flat racing? Is it putting horses into starting stalls? And I think at some point you're going to have to stand up as a sport and say that this is what we are. We do the best by the animal, but as an industry, we're professional, and we've using these methods as it's the best way for the horse. A horse is bred to race, and there's so many variables with it. But I do think the authorities and ourselves as a racing community have to, at some point, draw a line and say that we're working with everyone here, but we got to be firm what we believe that is the right thing to do for the sport as well.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, because on the one hand there's that expertise and understanding and years of experience, and then there's science that questions some of the what received wisdom, I suppose, what people actually believe happens when a horse is struck with the whip, and it's not settled. We don't have all the answers, but I'm always, I think if we're open to listening and combining and blending what we know and what we've done with what potentially could be solutions, we have some chance. I think if we just say no, you can't come any further, you can't encroach on what we do, I think that's not the message that society wants to hear, and I think that's when there's threat. I think when we are seen to be thinking, talking, listening, exploring, I think we have a chance.
Very, very much so, and I think that's very important, is to bring people in and welcome them into the game. And I think these, I don't know how it works in Australia, but it's maybe more of an urban training environment there. But likes of having open mornings where the public can go to a training establishment, go to a stud farm, see what goes on behind the scenes, because what you see for them a couple of minutes on a racetrack doesn't reflect the work or the care, everything that goes into getting a horse from birth to the race course, and that's a very important meter that I do think racing is, for all it look like a closed shop perhaps, people landing into the race for the first time. I do think it's very important that we're seen to be open, and in generally racing people are very welcoming to outsiders, and I think the more that can be put out there, the better. You won't be able to engage with certain sections of society that are totally anti-race, so there's it's very hard to please everybody, but I do think you need to engage with as many people as possible. That's
certainly our ethos here. It's just exploring, seeing if there's what happens in different countries, different cultures, and talking to scientists, talking to practitioners, and everyone in between. And
so Mita was telling me that she was at the races and bumped into you a few weeks ago with a friend of hers who was from a non-racing background, and you were explaining about the cues that jockeys use for racehorses. And I'm a rider, but I've never ridden I've ridden plenty of old racehorses, but I've never ridden in a race. And as a rider, I'm just a bit interested if you could expand a bit on that conversation and tell us a bit about the cues that jockeys use while they're riding.
Yeah, I suppose that conversation Mita was off the cuff in Navan, and I actually found myself in a bit of a flow state, so I hope I can repeat it. But I suppose for most jockeys, they start off riding ponies. They're out in a traditional sense, out hunting. They're out riding ponies over poles and that. So your initial education comes from that, and anybody that's ever ridden a 12-2 pony knows that it can be quite a challenge in their own right. They definitely they're small, but they're like a terrier in their instincts. So you gain that experience over the years, and that transitions to a totally different style of riding when you get on a racehorse. But the basics of it are all very the same, and I think your mentality of the individual rider does come out with the horse as well. If you can be as relaxed as possible with a horse, they definitely feel it from the time you get up on it. If you're riding a horse that's on its nerves, and you can use your voice, your hands, your body movement to try and relax it, I think it's very important. I used to be a big believer in talking to the horse. People probably think you're mad, but I'd be reassuring them, hand movements, just going to the start. You'd be patting down the neck, you'd be maybe taking your feet out of the irons, just trying to get them relaxed and get their heart rate down, basically get them in the right frame of mind pre-race. Easier said than done, because sometimes the individual, particularly when you're dealing with shorter runners, they're ready to go, they're primed, they're like the sprinter type racer that you see in athletics. You can't afford to miss missed a gun or their race is over. So it's balancing that as well. But as regards when the race opens, and I think it was a middle distance race we looked at with Meet and Orla in Navan, that's where I used to enjoy riding most, because there's so many elements to riding over a middle distance 2,400 metre race that is probably unseen by the public, but it's highly important. You got to get your horse out, you got to have your plan, get out of gates as quickly as you want as possible if you want to go forward, but then you don't want to set the horse alight and get them over racing. So it's a fine line between using that initial energy to get started and get your position without giving the horse the cue that you really want to race. So that's a fine art in itself, in that you're not over urging the horse, that you've just got them into a tempo where you want to be at. And then it's trying to get your hands down on the horse's wither and get them relaxed. And the more you can do that, the more they'll relax, the more they'll start breathing. And that's a huge thing with race riding and for horses. If you're not breathing and doing things in the right manner, as I said earlier, they're not going to finish out the race. And I was always, probably to my detriment on occasions with certain connections, I was always a believer in that if you're not travelling at a stage of a race early on, why should I force them to be there? I'd let the horse fall back into run a little bit and get them on their feet, get them comfortable, and generally they'd finish off strongly at the death. And it's rein contact as you go through the tempo of the race. You're trying to build up, and from a long rein to medium rein, Karen, if you're obviously going slow on a horse, you're riding off a long rein, you're trying to, by your gradually moving your reins and shortening your whip rein hand closer to the bit, the horse, hopefully if he's got the power and energy under him, is reacting to that and taking your urging. So without even using the whip down the shoulder as such, or in a backhand position, before you see a jockey go into full drive position, it's all through the reins, through the hands. They might be squeezing with their heels, and then obviously when the race really begins to develop, you get into your riding pushing motion that you gradually build up into your top finish inside the final 200 metres. But it's very nuanced, and with experience it does get better over time. But I do think the main thing is getting your horse using themselves well in a good rhythm, and particularly the element is very important, that they're doing things that they're not using as much energy as they would do if not relaxed.
Yeah.
So some of those horses, Fran, you would never have sat on it, potentially. You might be just meeting them for the first time in the parade ring. How do you deal with that?
Obviously, trainer, when you weigh out or you're on the phone to your trainer, you'd have a good chat with them and get a gauge for the horse as well. And with video replays now, if they had the experience of running on the track, you'll have got a good look at the replays, and that'll give you a feel for the horse as well. And with younger type horses, obviously you're relying on the feedback of the trainer. Maybe they're making their debut on the track, but one thing I always found important was seeing how they're behaving in the parade ring when you get your leg across them initially, and talking to the groom or the strapper that's leading them up. I always found very beneficial. They're the ones dealing with the horse every day, and they'll give you an insight into, he's got this quirk, or he likes that, or just mind him at this. And I always find that really beneficial, that the staff, it's underrated knowledge that they have of the horse. They're the ones living with them 7 days a week. I'm only getting on them 4 or 5 minutes on a race day. Mm-hmm. And when you get on the track meet, you usually have, at the Curragh, if you're riding a mile race, you've got a mile to get to the start, and the feel you can get from a horse and their mannerisms and the way they're acting around other horses is definitely something I used to pick up on. If they're shying away from other horses, if they're showing signs of inexperience, then in the race, likely if they're drawn in the middle of the pack, that they're going to be quite shy in amongst the pack. And it's just taking little clues from that and work it out on your way to the start in the time you got to get to the gates. And it's throwing it all together. You won't get it right, but it's a learning curve for you and the horse. But the more experienced the horse, the more knowledge you'll have going into the race, obviously, than a debutant, if you like.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned there about taking your feet out of the irons. I noticed Colin Keane does that an awful lot. Colin Keane, Karen, is one of our leading Irish jockeys here, and he's very good at getting horses to relax, and also uses the whip in very, very limited fashion. And I just think that's interesting to see that he's so successful.
Yeah, and Colin's a very, very good example of that meet. And as you said, he's not known as a full-on whip jockey as well either. Like Colin goes to whip, he usually means he's only got a little bit left in his horse in the final 100 metres of a race, final 200 metres. But he's an amazing example of a jockey using his body weight to get a horse to roll forward. He's very, very good. He rarely seems to get beaten in a close finish, and he seems to get able to get his horse's head down on the line, as we say in the game. But it's all through body weight. It's all through a unique kind of style as well. It's a style you couldn't teach to individual riders. And that's the thing about being a jockey. If you look at a race, it's not a uniform style in Europe, at least, or in Australia. That there's different aspects. There's riders find different ways to get a horse to work with their body, and obviously in their physical limitations as well. But it's fascinating. I find that fascinating all the way through, to see how different riders react and how to use themselves to get the best result for their horse.
Yeah, that's so true, because you can spot jockeys. You know who's riding that horse, even though you haven't looked at the race card or you haven't looked at your phone. They have such individual styles. I hadn't really thought about it, but it's so true. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's amazing. It's amazing that things can work, for certain riders and not for others. And in the US, riders are of uniform kind of racing style, and as I said, Europe and Australia, Europe more so maybe than Australia, but with different shapes and sizes of a rider. And as you said, it's quite distinctive once a rider gets to a certain level of experience, that you can just automatically pick them out, and the different ways that they can make things work for them. The most successful riders I've seen over the years, Kieran Fallon used to ride a horse off the buckle end of the rein, basically. It was amazing to see him, and one of the most successful riders of all time. Then you had Pat Smullen, a good friend of mine, the late Pat Smullen, used to ride a horse off a very short rein in a finish, and used to be tight and into the horse. And obviously Colin Keane is somewhere in the middle of that. So that's one of the most fascinating things for me, and trying to explain that to the public is probably my job, but it's one that is underestimated. Maybe we should make more of as well, the skill and the differential in the different way people can go about getting to the winning post is quite interesting.
That's really interesting, given the way you just described the different jockeys with the different sort of lengths of rein that they use. It shows that there are different ways to get the job done. So it makes me wonder, as a jockey, what we could do to help the industry give a better ride for the horses in racing, in terms of, is there some low-hanging fruit that you could see that we could implement to make things better?
I think you need a level of natural ability, and obviously with coaching now, there's a new coaching program coming into Ireland with a lot of ex-riders going to be mentoring young riders, so that's going to be a big addition as well. But you do need to marry up having a level of ability with the coaching and the finessing as well, and that will improve the standard of riding, I think.
Can I ask you a hard question, and you don't have to answer this if you don't feel comfortable? Do jockeys think about the horses they're riding? Do they think about them as horses, or do they just see them as another tool of the trade in their quest for winners?
It's a hard one when you're in the middle of hard one to answer, in that when you're in the middle of riding 10 or 12 horses a day, that can be lost a little bit. Obviously, if you're riding based with a trainer, riding a horse a lot more in the mornings that you're riding in the afternoons, you've got that relationship with the horse, and obviously you got the relationship with the owner, the breeder, on a more personal level than you would. And when you're picking up outside rides that you're only getting on for the first time that day, you've got that 3 or 4 minutes to get on with the horse and dare. So you don't have that level of rapport, and it's not that you're taking the horse for granted, but the more involved you are with the horse in the mornings, definitely the more into it you are in the afternoons with what goes before and after with the horse, if that makes sense. It's very hard when you pick up 7 or 8 outside rides through a day, but I always found it, as regards riding, and I think it's probably coming through now with my TV end of things, that I like to come back and give as much feedback and positive feedback, if that makes sense, for connections, where to go with the horse, how to get the best result from the horse, give them something to work with. So in that, on that level, you're definitely forward thinking. I always try to be with the horse that the owner and trainer had an idea where they're going on the back of me riding that horse for 5 minutes, even if I'd only seen it before in the paddock pre-race.
So one of the things we do on this podcast that I've realised is we talk a lot about welfare, but we don't actually ask our guests what they, when they hear the word welfare, what they think welfare means. So I was just curious, what does welfare mean to you, Fran?
I think it's treating the horse right. You know, you gotta accept that in the industry that we are in horse racing, that horse we're using are bred to race. It's been obviously refined over a couple of 100 years to the level that it is now. But these horses are being bred to race. It's all they know. So when they start, you have to accept that there will be an injury rate at some point of the horse career. But it's I don't. How do you say this? You have to have a level of acceptance that there's going to be injuries along the way, but on that side, you got to have stringent veterinary controls. You got to do everything right by the horse. I do think, welfare licensed individuals that fall down in welfare should be come down hard on. And if we can do all of that in a round, and as an industry, say that the thoroughbred is, in racing terms at least, has been highly and as well looked after as possible. I do think that is the most important thing. And obviously end of life is becoming a more, post racing and end of life has become more of an issue. And I think that's something that we got to really think about as well. The chain from the end of racing to the end of life is very, very important. I think that's going to become more prevalent in the next couple of months. So for me, what we do with the horse from birth to racing could not be any better. You got to accept there's going to be injuries, but it's from the end of racing and what happens beyond that I do think we really got to work on.
Mm-hmm. If it's any consolation, Fran, welfare scientists argue among themselves about what welfare actually means. There's no settled definition. So
it's what aspect you take of it, isn't it? It's,
exactly. Exactly, and it's probably governed by your worldview and your values and where you're coming from. So there are papers and books and there's so much written just about that definition. So it's that. My earlier question might have been hard, but I think that's a harder one, even though it seems very simple.
It is, and where do you start? I suppose looking at it from the kind of horse racing end of things.
So, Fran, in this changing room studio, we have a genie. She's invisible; you can't see her, and we can't always predict what she's going to do. She comes up with various things for our guests to do. But anyway, the scenario she has picked for you. We all want racing to have a better future, and she reckons jockey training needs to focus more on the horse and on horse welfare. And you would be the best person to take over the education and training of young jockeys. And assume that there's no constraints, money's no object. Where would you start? What steps and supports would you put in place?
It's kind of relevant at the minute. Obviously, there's a bit happening in that area in Ireland, and the UK is a little bit ahead of us. But if you gave me a blank budget, I think I'd go back to having a residential type program like they have at race in the past, in that you'd have 15 to 20 jockeys. And there's one issue that's going to really come to prominence in the next couple of years, is that unfortunately as our population gets bigger, jockeys are getting bigger, and you see younger apprentices nowadays. So that's something I think that's going to become a big issue in the next 15 to 20 years. I think the biggest thing, and if you're relating to the horse, is making jockeys horsemen or horsewomen. And I do think having that rapport, starting off with, not everyone can come from a pony racing type background, and you got to take that. But people need to learn from the start. I think the traditional apprenticeship where you learned about horse care, horse management, for all that I hated it when I was in my dad's every day, and I was mucking out and hosing horses and doing them over the evenings. I think that gives you an ingrained love of the horse as well, and I do think that's very important. You just can't get on a horse and be a jockey, you can, but it doesn't make you a more rounded rider. So for that element, I would definitely start off in that direction, slow steps. So education is kept up as well. But as regards training, start with horse management, getting people to know the ins and outs of what it takes to look after a horse, how the horse works is very, very important. And with a lot of ex-pros around now that have an insight, I think you can marry up the best of them with a jockey coaching program. You see it in football, you see it in rugby, you see the way that the Irish rugby camp or rugby underage team does now, with the senior team coming through. I'd work off that kind of a mantra that this is a all-in program for people, that they got to really buy into it. You got to reward them as well. You got to make it financially viable for them. I do think the elephant in the room is going to be the weight of young riders in the coming years. That would be a concern for me. When I started, I was the tallest young rider in the weighing room. Now I'm interviewing young apprentices of 17, 18 years of age, and they're looking down at me. So at some point that will become an issue. There will be a tipping point perhaps.
That's really interesting what you say about teaching them to be horse people first, because I see those programs that HRI run where they bring the simulator to the races or for schools, school visits, and I see the kids getting up in the simulators and thinking they're jockeys, and I often think, but that's not a living being. You know what I mean? That doesn't tell them anything about riding a horse in reality. It might give the sensation of the motion, whatever, but it doesn't. They're not horses. And I just think that connection and building and having that connection with horses as living sentient beings is really, really important. And I think once you've been exposed to it, unless you are totally hard-hearted, it'll never leave you. So I think it's really, really important that's embedded.
Yeah, and at York Racecourse, I get on very well with the team at York Racecourse, and they're obviously very, very forward thinking in everything that they do. But at the Eber meeting last year and the Dante meeting this year, they had a horse charity, New Beginning. They did 2 or 3 ex-race horses on the infield during racing for the public to come and interact with. Obviously, it's a good shop window for them as a fundraiser to make and to make people aware of what to do. But as you said, Meeta, I think seeing a living horse up close at the races where a horse are running and this horse raced, I think that's it's a very important thing as well, that there is a life beyond racing for these horses, but they're actually living, breathing animals as well, like not just a number with a saddle cloth on them, if you like.
Back earlier in the podcast, Fran, you mentioned about how the Japanese waited a bit longer with their horses, and you felt that was related to greater longevity for the horses. Do you think that's something that other jurisdictions would look at as a way of helping horses in the future?
Yeah, I probably should preface that with they're bred to be more middle distance, longer term horses in Japan. They've bought up a lot of the high class middle distance stock in Ireland, whether in Ireland and Europe in particular, of mares. So they're only actually probably bred to get better from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, and that's the way they play it. But I do think our program here in Europe, Karen, and in Australia somewhat forces connections to press on with horses maybe sooner than ideal. There's a real 2-year-old short distance program. You've got your Golden Slipper, we've Royal Ascot next week, and if you've got a smaller, sharply bred 2-year-old, the onus is really on to get them out early. And now if they don't get there, you can back off them, give them time, but there is that pressure element with the juveniles, and it's not something I'm really into. I think we're the way the game is going here in Ireland and Europe, I do think while speed is sexy, I do think we got to try and get people into thinking longer term. There's a huge market now for middle distance horse from Europe to Australia in particular as well, and I think if people take the longer view, it'll be better for the breeding industry over here and the breed in itself. I do think speed is not going to be for the betterment of the sport and the thoroughbred in the future.
Yeah, we've interviewed a fellow a little while ago. He's on one of our earlier episodes, and he talked about what's happened between circuses and zoos, and basically what he was saying was that people had concerns about animals in circuses, and the people in the circus industry more or less didn't take on board those concerns, and now circuses are more or less a thing of the past, whereas the similar concerns were expressed about zoos, and the zoos took those concerns on board and made really significant changes in the way that they care for their animals and the way they exhibit the animals, and zoos are thriving. So I guess what I'm curious about is if the public have these concerns and we don't take them seriously and we don't make some changes, even if we don't necessarily feel like we need to make those changes, but if the public says we need to make them, we risk not having the sport at all in the future. So it just seems really curious that's something that potentially, and look, I'm not a racing person, so I don't really know, but it just seems such to me a small thing to wait that little bit extra, and if you have that huge welfare benefit, then that would be something that you could initiate. But maybe that's not the case.
That's why you're the perfect person to ask these questions, because we're on the inside, and we need people to say why isn't this happening, why isn't that happening in a positive way, so that you can, and we need as an industry people to give you food for thought, and that's very important. And why is this being done? Well, it's the way it's always been done, but that doesn't mean it's the right way to be doing things, so it's very important. I think what Mita said earlier on about educating people how well you're doing, but be very open to improvements, and people's questioning of why you're doing this and why is this being the way it's always been done. You won't if you're not improving and looking forward. It's probably back to what I said about me trying to ride and trying to do this as a sport. If you're not with that mentality, you're just burying your head in the sand, and it's all going to come down on you at some point. So the more you can bring people with you, and if you've got as an outsider question to ask, I think if you can't answer it in a good way, then you're probably not doing it right.
Fran, I think that's a brilliant way to wrap up our chat, because it sums up what we're about here. We've really enjoyed the conversation. I know I certainly have. And I think we will find a way through this. We will. The future is. I'm confident, but we do need to have these conversations.
Very much so, and it's been great to be on. It's given me plenty of food for thought over the last couple of days thinking about it. So always a good thing.
Thank you so much, Fran. I've really enjoyed meeting you, and I've really enjoyed our conversation today.